When you start a new game for the first time, what is the first thing that you do? Do you go through the settings and adjust everything to your liking, or do you mash that confirm button to get right into the action? Personally speaking, the thing that I always do when setting up a new playthrough is first figuring out the control scheme. A few years ago, I decided to give Genshin Impact a chance on my PS4 after hearing all the hubbub on how cool and great it was. I'm not much of a gacha gamer, but the gameplay intrigued me, so I figured why not. It looked like an action game, and you all know how much I like those. However, when I gained control of my character and decided to try out the buttons, I was wildly uncomfortable. So I did what I normally do when a control scheme isn't doing it for me, and went into the controller options menu to discover that there was no way to change the button layout. I tried to roll with it, but after that session, I deleted the game and hadn't felt a need to return to it until recently, where I had a sponsorship through them, where I then discovered that I could change the controller layout now that I was playing on PC. Customizable control schemes are something that I've always hammered on when it comes to accessibility in video games, and it always boggles my mind when someone rolls their eyes and dismisses the idea completely when, in my opinion, it should be a staple in every video game. Before we begin with the discussion, I actually want to start with a little experiment that I would like you to participate in. Right now, I want you to think about the controller that you prefer using, and hold it in your hands if you're able to. I'm gonna say a word, and when I say that word, press the button that you think corresponds with that action. If you're not ready, just pause the video real quick if you need to, then come back. If you aren't participating in the exercise, then obviously you can continue on. Are you ready? Here we go. Dodge. Hopefully you did it, and you can let me know in the comments what button you pressed if you want. For myself, I pressed the circle button on my PlayStation controller. The main reason why I associate dodging with circle, and if you know me, I'm sure you've guessed already, is because of my time with the Devil May Cry series, since this is the default input for the Trickster dodge. This is also the button associated with dodge rolling in the Dark Souls series, as well as dodging in the Marvel Spider-Man games. And I'm sure everybody who participated pressed different buttons, which is to be expected as we each have our own unique biases when it comes to our upbringings with certain video games. Perhaps you pressed the shoulder button because of your time with Hi-Fi Rush, or maybe you're a Bayonetta player and pressed the right trigger. Or you could be a Kingdom Hearts nut and pressed the square button. Unlike other forms of media, video games are meant to be interactive, so it shouldn't be that big of a leap to say that the button mapping for a game needs to have a great deal of thought put into it. This, of course, starts with the controller itself, and I can't be the only one that thinks having the ability to control video games with our thoughts would alleviate the issues I'm about to talk about. In recent years, it has become possible to play video games with your mind using a special headset and brain-computer interface. This practice being made famous from Twitch streamer Pericarial, where she uses this technique to play games like Minecraft, Halo, and more famously, Elden Ring. This is great for accessibility, as this could be especially helpful for people with disabilities who have trouble pressing the inputs manually on a controller. While it's a very simple concept, it's currently a lot more tedious than the result it presents.
For attacking, I'm imagining pushing something heavy really forward. For healing, I'm imagining something falling on top of my face. It takes hours of training to do this, so it's kind of like an on-off switch. Is it there or is it not? And if it's there, up past a certain threshold, then it presses the key through the command and node red and the coding and stuff. That's one of the limitations with EEG. There's a lot of noise. It's not necessarily a limitation of the device, but a limitation of how much we know about the brain. I mean, there's always going to be that, regardless of how amazing your equipment is.
For the time being, however, the integral and most common part of the medium when connecting to the world of video games is the controller. Speaking on accessibility, over the years there have been a number of conversations about games needing to be more accessible, even having accessibility awards given out at the Game Awards in recognition of it. But it's interesting to me that even recent video game releases are still lacking what I consider to be a basic feature. And I'm sure I'm not overstepping when I say if a player is able to make changes to a control scheme to fit their own personal preferences, they'll be able to get into a variety of different games much more easily, especially when playing a completely different genre or style that they're used to. Having the option to change universal features, especially at the very beginning of a playthrough, can go a long way in getting more people into newer experiences, which of course is the whole point of accessibility. And speaking from experience, I've always been able to transition into a new game easier with a control layout that was even slightly familiar to me, especially if I'm able to make a correlation with a particular action. During my playthrough of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, my first ever Soulsborne experience, the typical Soulsborne layout of attack on R1 was completely new to me, especially after a decade of experience on Devil May Cry and the other various action games that I played. The first thing I did was change the attack button to triangle and the grapple hook to R2, as these were the actions that were most familiar to me, and I knew I would instinctively press on a quick reaction. I left jump and dodge on their respective buttons, cross and circle, circle, because just like with attack and grapple, these are the placements that I'm used to. Any action I wasn't familiar with, such as the prosthetic tools and the tool cycler, I replaced with R1 and L2, as I could learn to use these actions and get more comfortable with them as I progressed through the game. And a change as simple as this helped ease me into a game I already knew was going to be a challenge. Shortly after I started, a friend of mine at the time who had already played Sekiro came over and opened a new save to mess around, and he commented on how weird it was that I had to switch the controls in the first place and put the actions in such weird placements. I found it interesting that what's considered weird to someone can be comfortable for others, as I know his experience with other Soulsborne games makes him more comfortable with attack on R1. But here's the question that I want to pose now on that front. How likely are you to continue playing a game when you're not comfortable with your controller layout, and how often are you willing to come back for repeated sessions? I've found that with a custom layout, I'm more willing to come back in the future to either finish the game or play through it again upon completion. Obviously, this is because it's easier to return to a game where the control scheme is familiar enough to where I don't have to do any mental gymnastics to get the gears turning again. One of the things that I harp on about, even in my personal life as a martial artist, is muscle memory. And I know I'm not the only one who dislikes it when established muscle memory contracts with a new or different action. Giving a quick example I've used in my classes, I'm able to perform what's called a cheat 720, something that I consider to be an intermediate trick. The next level to that would be a cheat 900, and in theory, the only thing you have to do differently is adding in an extra half rotation and kicking with the other leg. Both practicing and teaching these movements, I found that the hardest part of this move isn't the extra rotation, but rather going against your pre-established muscle memory and kicking with your opposite leg, since the movements and how you perform them are nearly identical, minus the ending. When it comes to video games, the best examples I can personally draw from here are the Bayonetta games. As much as I love this series, as I played through the games and more mechanics were introduced, the controller layout had very subtle changes that made it difficult to go from game to game seamlessly, especially when Bayonettas 2 and 3 have preset controls that never really quite fit with what I wanted. This then leads into our next topic of discussion: immersion. Unlike other forms of media, video games are an interactive medium where the connection between the player and the game is the input of the player itself. The gameplay is usually at its best when players can fully immerse themselves in the game's world, and nothing ruins that immersion more than the recognition of the controller, the medium where the player interacts with the game to create that feeling. If the player is fully immersed, then the player's thoughts and actions are represented in the game by their character, and may get to a point where we start to see ourselves in that character progressing through the game. A common example is groaning or wincing in pain when your character takes a big hit, and I know for a fact I'm not the only one that does this. What breaks this immersion for me personally more often than bugs and crashes is the reminder that I'm in the normal world pressing buttons on a controller. It's the difference between dodging an attack on reaction and knowing you need to press circle to dodge. The problem isn't that you did or did not dodge the attack correctly, but that you had to acknowledge the controller. I'll give another example in a game I've put hundreds of hours into. Let's say a fighting game in this instance. If I'm in the middle of a match, and someone in chat told me to use Shoryuken when my opponent jumps in, I would just simply execute the move, and I wouldn't even need to think about the motion. But if that same person asked me what the exact input for Shoryuken was, I would have to think for a second and likely do the inputs on my controller or in my head before I could give them the correct answer. This is also a big reason why I personally was struggling heavily when getting into the 2XKO beta, because one of the things that I was really excited about with 2XKO is that it's basically like a Marvel vs. Capcom tag game. But the problem is that when thinking that, my muscle memory and the way that I was going about playing the game was like I was playing a Marvel game, when in actuality, you're not really supposed to think that way. And this was especially challenging for me with the simple special moves, where you have to press one of the two special buttons in a certain direction to get a certain special move off. And one of the things that I really wish that the game had, and maybe would implement in the future if it was possible, would be having the option to choose the simple inputs or the motion inputs. This is something that I feel Street Fighter 6 does really well with their modern controls. When the game first released, a lot of people were giving flack to those that were using the modern controls because it was easier and they weren't earning their inputs and wins. However, the modern controls in Street Fighter 6 make the game accessible for so many people who either just can't grasp their head around the motion inputs of the classic control schemes, or playing in a completely different playstyle. And I'll come out and say that I'm actually a modern control user. I currently have 3 mains in Street Fighter 6. I play as Luke, I play as Ken, and I play as Zangief. Now with Luke and Ken, I'm using the classic control scheme because I'm used to the DP motions and just the way that the characters are in the game. However, I have never used a grappler in any of the fighting games that I have played. And there was something about the modern control scheme that made playing Zangief so much fun for me. And right now, he's debatably my favorite character to play as. And it's not like it's giving me an easy way to win the game either, because even though I have a one-button SPD, I still need to actually play the game and play the neutral of a grappler, which I'm not used to. And in fact, when it comes to the rankings, my Zangief is only slightly higher than Ken and Luke. But that's just because I've been having so much fun playing Zangief that I just want to play more of him. Now, I'm not saying all of this to gloat that I'm a great video game player because I've been able to memorize all of these different inputs and execute them consistently under various degrees of pressure, but it's this type of connection where your thoughts can translate directly into the actions of a character in the game without even acknowledging the controller, to the point where you can tell when something is even slightly off, such as having a release check on or off in an NRS game. And since I just gave a bunch of examples pertaining to fighting games, I can't miss this opportunity to talk about the late Broly Legs, one of my favorite fighting game players and a huge inspiration to many in the community. Broly Legs had an immense amount of dedication to be one of the best fighting game players in the world, and he was able to achieve that goal through the use of customizing his controller layout and having an open approach to the mechanics in the games he played, most notably Street Fighter. He was able to compete on a high competitive level not as someone with a disability, but as a good player overall. And unfortunately, Broly Legs passed away in March of this year, and this loss was felt by everyone in the fighting game community. Going back on topic, further additions to Immersion for myself also include vibrations. I seem to be in the minority when it comes to having vibrations on for my controllers, but just like with custom buttons, I feel like it helps amplify my experience of Immersion, where any action my gaming avatar takes, even if damage is taken, is expressed through the vibrations of the controller. These vibrations also help me with button timing and reaction timing, and I feel like I've developed my own style because of it. And after recently getting a PC and not having access to the vibrations in many of the games that I normally play on console, this was the first thing I noticed. Even having the ability to customize the vibrations of the controller, and in the PlayStation 5's case, the adaptive triggers, is just another fine addition to customizing your experiences to however you see fit to maintain your immersion. A counterpoint I've been given in my ramblings is that in many cases, if a game doesn't have rebindable controls, they will more than likely have a second, in some cases third, fourth, and fifth control scheme options that are also pre-made. While these are made to be convenient for people with different loadout preferences, it still poses the same problem. In my case, I've rarely, if ever, felt the need to use them when given to me, since no matter what loadout I choose, something will always feel off. And I've never understood why the developers would give us more preset controls without the ability to customize it freely, especially since finding a single button layout that appeals to everybody would be impossible. The benefits of having fully customizable button layouts are so obvious to me that it makes me wonder why there are people that argue against it. Even game developers, most notably Platinum Games, had a reputation for a while of having very little, if any, interest in implementing custom controls and accessibility options in their games. While they've gotten better over the years, I still remember back in the day starting and dropping Bayonetta on multiple occasions because I just couldn't get comfortable with the controller layout without any way to change it. More specifically, the placement of the Witch Time dodge button. As I stated earlier, I was able to eventually get adjusted to the general control scheme for the Bayonetta games, but advancing through the series and having those subtle changes was really frustrating, especially since there were preset loadouts without the ability to fully change it. Another recent example is with Final Fantasy XVI, a game I've had such high praise for. I had a great experience with Final Fantasy XVI, but one of my biggest nitpicks when I started the game was the fact that I couldn't customize the controls to my liking, while only getting a few preset loadouts. And since this game was basically what I could only describe as Final Fantasy May Cry, I needed to change my control layout. As updates were coming out for the game, they gradually added more preset loadouts and eventually gave us the ability to fully customize the controls. However, at this point, anything other than the default controls would have felt so jarring to me, especially after committing over 50 hours to learning the control scheme. This also meant that going back into the game to tackle the DLC was a real challenge for me. It felt like I had to relearn how to play the game each time I went back, and struggled on fights that I would have considered a cakewalk in my initial playthrough. Comparing this to my long stretches without playing Devil May Cry, if someone bet me gift subs to jump into DMC3 and first try the final boss on the hardest difficulty, I'd feel confident enough to make an attempt at the very least. Something that I discovered a few years ago that I thought was really interesting was button remapping in the settings for the DualShock 4 on the PlayStation 4, which is also present in the PlayStation 5. While I understand where they were going with this, the remapping occurs in the PlayStation hardware rather than on the software being used, or in other words, the video game itself. The biggest problem with this is that any QuickTime events and on-screen button prompts, such as a menu or tutorials, won't update with the PlayStation hardware, which means that these prompts will have to be interpreted twice. Once for the button presented on the screen, and again for the button you're actually supposed to press. It's like when you're going over to your friend's house to play Xbox when you've been a PlayStation guy all your life, and the X prompt is brought up on screen and you press what would be the PlayStation cross button, instead of where it is on the Xbox controller. And this also doesn't help that on the Switch Pro controller, the X button is also in a different spot. And something similar to this actually happened to me while I was playing Bayonetta 1. I did my first playthrough on a Switch Pro controller, but sometimes when a QTE prompt would appear in a cutscene, it would show the Nintendo Switch as if I was playing the game in handheld mode. This brief moment of confusion would cause me to have a delayed reaction to process what I was seeing on screen, and I would fail the prompt because I took too long. This would happen multiple times, even when I went through the exact same QTE. It's a good gesture for these gaming companies to add these hardware button remappings, but I fear we still have a long way to go before we get that perfect answer. As I mentioned earlier, games are meant to be interactive, and each player who picks up your controller is going to be different. And by acknowledging this and acting accordingly with a fully customizable control scheme is only going to help more players play your game, which is the whole point in making a product. I know I'm not the only one that thinks this way, and one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video in the first place was to share my experiences and voice my suggestions, and I'm sure the reason why we have so many accessibility features, and even various controllers made for those with disabilities, is because there was a vocal demand for them, and they listened to us. So game devs, come here for a second. If there's one thing that I would like you to take away from this video, it's this. The next time that the topic of making a game more accessible to everyone is brought up, don't forget to add in a fully customizable controller option. If you made it this far into the video, I just wanted to say, thanks for watching as always. If you enjoyed my ramblings, please consider leaving a like on the video, as it'll help reach more people on YouTube, and if you want to see more videos like this from me, be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you want to support the channel even more, I would encourage you to become a YouTube member, where you'll get access to a bunch of special perks and some cool emotes. I'll also leave links for my other social media platforms in the description if you want to see even more content from me. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.